order. Members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, online listeners, and Twitter followers. And please note that you can follow the State Board of Education on a Twitter page at @EDStateBoard_NC. You can also follow our meeting online and see all of our materials by going to SBE meetings at www.ncpublicschools.org. For our visitors and those listening online, today's agenda involves our board discussions on agenda items, and tomorrow's agenda is the official meeting date when we'll vote on the appropriate action items. I want to thank our educators across the state who've been preparing for the start of the 2023 school year, and for those in year-round schools who have already returned to school. We have been aware of the professional learning, facility improvements, and extra student supports that have been delivered over the summer to ensure that the needs of our students are addressed, and we're appreciative of all those efforts. Again, thank you, and we look forward to a successful school year. I'm also delighted to thank our new State Board of Education advisors who will be formally introduced today. But joining us today is Mr. Don Phipps, Superintendent of the Year, Donna Bledsoe, Principal of the Year, Kimberly Jones, Teacher of the Year, and our Student Advisor, Josiah Jennings. We appreciate your service. Jump right in and let us know what you're thinking, because we need to learn from you, and we look forward to officially welcoming each of you tomorrow. Board members, you're reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us today? If so, please state them for the record, and if during the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and voting on the matter. Board members, you received the agenda last week, had the opportunity to review it. I ask if there are any requests for changes to the agenda. Hearing none, I request a motion for approval.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. Kamnitz, second by Mr. Keenan. Any discussion? Hearing none, Dr. Petrie Martin.
Dr. Oxendine, Mrs. Kamnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Keenan,
Yes.
Mr. Hull,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers, Mr. Blackburn,
Yes.
Dr. Ford, Treasurer Falwell, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes. Thank you. We have an agenda, and we'll begin our discussions with the Student Learning and Achievement Committee led by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Dr. Olivia Oxendine joins me in doing the work of this committee, and we have a very brief agenda today. So we'll start, as we always do, with Dr. Day and a standards revision update.
Thank you. Good morning. We're really excited to be here to give you a brief update. As a reminder, our state board policy, SCOS 012, that guides our standards review and revision process. Next, we have the manual where you will find details that outline what we do during the process from the beginning of review all the way through implementation. And we have been sticking to this process to a T to make sure that there is consistency across all content areas when it comes to review, revision, installation, and implementation. So we'll start with Healthful Living. Our updates are the same as last month. We are still in process. The surveys have been released. They will close September 18th. And then from there, we start our cycle of the DRC. So they will receive all of the data after it's been analyzed and organized from OLR, and then they will complete their report that then goes over to the writers, and they'll begin their process of draft 2. So just as a reminder, for Healthful Living, we are still just in draft 1, and we get all the way to draft 3 before it comes to you for any action. Next, we have the arts and world languages. They are very similar. For the arts, the SWT, the standards writing team, was selected. Their orientation and work session was held the week of July 17th, so they are off doing their work of creating draft 1 of those standards. World languages, the SWT again has been selected. They held their work session last week, and so they are working on their draft 1 of their standards. For the guidance standards, it's a little bit different. The data that came in from our first collection with the current standards led the DRC to some recommendations of adopting the American School Counselor Association, ASCA, student mindsets and behaviors. In order to make sure that all stakeholders across the state understand what that means and to gather more data, we released a second survey that was released in the beginning of June. That was supposed to close in July, but we did not feel we had enough data yet. It didn't feel like it represented the state across all regions just yet. So we have extended that deadline to September 10th. Once that closes, data will be organized and analyzed by OLR, and the DRC will come back together to take a deep look into those very specific questions about those ASCA mindsets and behaviors. And that's our update.
Any questions for Dr. Day? This is a lot of moving parts right now, and I'm sure an overworked team, but we appreciate that you're going to eventually catch us up to the schedule that we need to be on these standards.
We are.
And this won't happen again. So,
No.
Any questions for Dr. Day? All right, hearing none, thank you. We'll see you next month. And finally, we have one consent item, which is SLA 1, which is the approval of the North Carolina Governor's School Board member appointments. We all know that the Governor's School is a summer program for our talented kids, and it is just an amazing program. And so this board that governs the work of the Governor's School, we are appointing 2 new members. The first is Dr. Isa, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Cox, who's the superintendent of Ashe County Schools, and Laura Parrott, who is director of advanced academics at the Durham Public Schools. Both of these nominations are designed to bring the right background and knowledge to the board, but also to preserve the geographic balance that we keep in that board. So we'll be voting to approve those 2 individuals tomorrow. And that is the end of my report.
Thank you, Ms. Kamnitz. I think that sets the record for the shortest SLA meeting in probably a decade. Next, we'll turn to the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee led by Mr. John Blackburn. Mr. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I serve as the chair of this committee along with my amazing vice chair, Jill Kamnitz. I would like to tell you that our committee report is going to be as short as the previous one, but it will not be. So, buckle up, but we've got good things coming. So our first action item is Dogwood Classical relocation. Ashley?
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. So this is an action item. I brought it before you last month for discussion. Dogwood Classical Academy, it is currently in the planning year, so it's a planning school not currently operating, scheduled to open fall 2024. They will open with K-5, about 350 students, and then at capacity it would be a K-8 school. They have been granted 2 delays. So the first delay was a result of facility challenges, mostly related to cost in Cabarrus County, which is where this applicant originally applied to locate. And the second delay was approved pursuant to recent legislation that allows a tolling of a charter term if there are delays in land use or development. So the current scheduled opening is fall 2024. The board of Dogwood Classical Academy has searched for a suitable solution for a facility in Cabarrus for the last couple of years. They've looked for land and building sites. They contacted over 100 churches to rent as temporary facilities. They did have one agreement, and then they were faced with the sewer moratorium that is currently in Cabarrus County. So they were unable to receive sewer, and meetings with Cabarrus County revealed that they would probably not receive sewer allocation for their level of intensity until 2027. As a result, this planning board voted in February of this year to move from Cabarrus to Iredell County, and they have identified a suitable property less than 5 miles from the Cabarrus border, and it's a former school facility previously operated by Iredell Statesville Schools. It was determined by this board that the best option was try to get a relocation so that they can maintain their proposed opening date of fall 2024. A relocation of over 5 miles or to any different LEA, whether it's just half a mile over the county border, requires state board approval. So a request for impact statements were sent to the 2 districts most likely to be impacted by enrollment. That was Mooresville Graded School District and Iredell Statesville. We did not receive a response from Iredell Statesville. However, we did receive one from Mooresville, and that has been provided and posted on eBoard. Dr. Gardner raises 3 points in his response. The first is that he questioned the target demographics and the need for additional support in literacy instruction given the high third grade reading EOG proficiency in the district. He states that the district has capacity to serve the enrollment of the area, so in other words, they're not over-enrolled. And he raises traffic issues of that area and close proximity to other public school options. The applicant board, Dogwood Classical Academy, responded to that impact statement. You have also been provided with that. They responded that they intend to enroll similar demographics of the district, especially in regards to economically disadvantaged, EC students, and English learners, and that they will have a weighted lottery, which is a lottery process charter schools can have, for economically disadvantaged and English language learners. They also presented a letter of support from the mayor of Mooresville, and they've met with an Iredell State Board member in support. They also believe that because the Mooresville area charter schools have long waiting lists, that this is an indication of demand, despite the fact that the Mooresville schools may not be at capacity. And then finally, they recognized the traffic concerns that were presented by Dr. Gardner, but presented information regarding proposed DOT plans to relieve congestion in the area. So those are the two responses you've received. This item is up for vote this month. Should this relocation be denied, this board would have a couple of choices. They would either need to continue delaying, and because this is a land use issue, they probably would be able to do that due to the legislation that allows that. I have not had discussions with them as to whether they would want to delay to 2027, but that would be a possibility. Or what happens at this point is that a school could exit the RTO process, which means, they leave the planning process, and should they want to apply down the road in a different county or back in back in Iredell, then they could do that. So those are the kind of options that would be available if this relocation were denied. If it's approved, then they will continue in the ready to open process, and we will prepare them for opening in their new location.
Any questions? Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, do you plan on having conversations with them concerning the two options? You said you hadn't spoken to them yet.
Well, I think they understand.
You think they understand?
Yeah, we would certainly have those. They're obviously hoping for an approval, but with any of our our planning year schools and our applicants, there's a lot of hurdles that get you from an applicant approval to opening. Currently, we have 7 schools in delays, so we have those conversations with them as they arise.
I was just thinking though that, hindsight's always, they're upfront. Let them know and make sure that they understand. They'll come back and well, you didn't tell me that.
Right.
I didn't know we had this choice. And not saying that it won't be approved, just the idea of everybody having the same base knowledge to make decisions for them. So I encourage that to happen. I really do.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Pull your microphone towards you.
I'm sorry. Here's my voice, here's my figure about it. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Superintendent.
Thank you, Chair Blackburn. So I thought that Dr. Gardner provided a very well articulated impact statement, but I have to say that when I read it, I thought to myself, well, if it didn't move me in terms of citing reasons of how they would be impacted, it made me think that the Dogwood Classical folks might want to reconsider going to this location. Because if I were Dogwood Classical reading this letter, I would think, wow, how am I going to compete with Mooresville graded, given the information that's in here and the other charter schools in the area?
Yeah, and I think in discussions with this board, I think they feel that they have I think now it's over 700 families that are interested in the school. Their belief is that they will pull kids from a variety of areas and certainly not just that district. And then given the fact that there are a lot of charter schools in that area, those charter schools, some of them have wait lists in the thousands. So I think it's, they see that demand.
Follow up? Well, I was not aware of those numbers that you just shared, and that, for me, then this becomes about parent choice. And if there is from an educator's point of view, there doesn't appear to be a need, because these are great neighborhood public schools that we're talking about. But as I have said many times, the highest performing public school is not always what a parent thinks is best for their child. And so, again, if I were the Dogwood Classical people, I would be questioning why this area, but if the waiting lists are there, the waiting lists are there.
Ms. Piquero, can you remind us how far this move is as the crow flies?
Yes, as the crow flies, I think it's about 4.5 miles across the border.
4.2 miles.
Yeah.
And they're moving into an existing, where they want to locate is was an existing public school, correct?
Correct, yes. So it's zoned for educational use.
Yes. Ms. Cameron?
Do you know why the existing public school, do you know why it's not being used, or?
I do not know why. I'm not sure.
We didn't get that.
Because it's over 100 years old.
But going back to, another question, you said that there were currently seven charter schools that were on delay. How many of those have to do with facilities?
All of them, I believe.
So, okay, this is not an unusual problem. It's-
No, it's definitely a problem we are seeing more and more. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Vice Chair?
I'd like to pick up on that last point. I mean, some other good points have already been made. But on that last point, I think we as a board have expressed some concern a number of times when we've had applications coming forward and there has been no facility identified. And I know we've heard some very strong advocacy about why you might not have a facility and what we might be doing to get a facility, but the point is, we've ended up having a number of these, and I guess you said 7 active, but we've had several others along the way as well where this has happened, and I think that that's a problem as we go forward. And in this instance, to go back to where they actually started, it sounds like it would be till 2027 before it would be feasible because of some county initiatives that are going on in Cabarrus County, if I've heard it correctly. So, I mean, I think I have concerns about the location of this when the school, something that's already been articulated. But I think we have to be exceedingly careful, and this is a place where I think these people can come back once they have a well-thought-out plan, where they're gonna go, lots of notice, go through the application process, and not be, they'll be delayed in time, but not in terms of delayed, and if they've got a good application, in fact, as they suggest they do, then they can move forward with it. But I think we've got to be a lot more careful, as we're trying to be as a board, about what the facility situation is up front, and if they've already gone 2 years and they're not ready, still understand there's other circumstances, but I think that's a real issue, ongoing, and it applies to this school as well.
Yeah, it's, so our accelerated applicants, they have to have a facility. That's one of the kind of hurdles you have to pass if you want to get open in a year. They have to have one that is identified, and actually I go out and we look at the facility and tour it and those sort of things to bring that information to the CSAP. With the standard applications, in this case like Dogwood, they have a 2-year kind of ramp up, and it's, what I've noticed is very hard for an applicant that might be writing an application 3 years prior to opening to identify something that would be available in 3 years, That's kind of the cutting, that's kind of the
Double-edged sword.
challenge. Yeah, the double-edged sword, there you go, that they're facing. It's we would like to know as soon as possible where you want this school to be located. But if we're talking about 3 years out, the reality of, the real estate is just not necessarily possible.
But the problem with that is when it comes to us, it's 2 years, and if you're gonna if you've located a facility, that's fine. If you're gonna build a facility, if you haven't already purchased land, the question is to whether in this building climate, you can actually purchase land, do the proper design, and actually get the school built within that 2-year time frame would be an extremely close call. In a lot of places, it's not happening that fast for our schools. So I think that's, at that 2-year point, and we're seeing this. I mean, we're seeing it in the actual results we're getting in terms of approvals for charters, and then having this issue come up with the deferrals and not being able to meet the timelines. One last question. You said 4.2 miles from the county line. How far is it from where the original site was planned to be or identified
That's
in
the
the
4.2
application?
miles.
That's, okay, it's not from the county line. Okay, thank you. That was, would better understand that. Thanks.
Ms. Gammons?
Just based on, to piggyback on Vice Chair Duncan's points, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that we may need to be rethinking the amount of time we give charters from the time that they approve, that the charter is approved to the opening. Perhaps they need more time because we are seeing this over and over again. But I also think in order to respect the process that we do have and the exhaustive scrutiny that applicants receive when the CSAB is considering what to do about the application, is very focused on a particular location. And when we get some significant change in location, I think we ought to be concerned about setting a pattern of doing that without the applicant having to go back to CSAB and taking another look at what now is going to be a different kind of setting in school, perhaps.
Just for the committees, or for the full board's knowledge, we did ask Ms. McCarroll to reach out to Iredell Statesville Schools, and we did not hear back from them. So she asked for a statement from them a couple of times. Am I correct in that? So yes, we did not hear a statement from Iredell schools. We did hear from Mooresville graded schools. So, any other questions?
Okay.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. And this was presented to CSAB, just all this information. They did vote unanimously to approve it.
Okay, thank you. EICS 2, Union Day Mission.
All right, Union Day is a public charter school in Union County. They have been operating since 2016, and they are our first state charter school to receive International Baccalaureate authorization. So they are starting up their IB program, and part of that process and getting approved for that requires a new mission statement that incorporates elements of the IB Portraits of a Learner. So they have a new mission statement. We discussed it last month, and it just requires approval and a mission statement change.
Any questions?
This is actually an out of curiosity question. Are there IB courses offered in Union County schools?
I do not know that.
We didn't ask that question, sorry. If you look at the mission statement, they really are gonna do.
I don't have a question about the mission statement. I just,
Yeah, I don't know. I do know that they're first charter school to go through the process.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashley. The next EICS 3 is draft eligibility criteria, standards, and procedures for admission to the school for the deaf and blind. Mr. Ryan.
Good morning, everyone. So before you, you have the revised and final proposed admissions criteria and procedures for the North Carolina School for the Deaf, the Eastern North Carolina School for the Deaf, and the Governor Moorhead School for the Blind. This was originally on for discussion at last month's meeting. Since then, we have had further discussions with the directors of those institutions as well as the staff here at DPI that support special education. We have made a couple of revisions to the documents which are reflected in the track changes version that you have, as well as the clean copy. I just want to highlight a couple of those changes and explain and provide an explanation for that prior to y'all having a vote today. First, after discussions with the directors, we have altered the first of those admissions criteria related to the minimum level of functioning necessary to participate in the educational programs. That first sentence, that language came directly from the enacting legislation as something that was required to be included. And we wanted to add a little bit of specificity to that, which originally resulted in those A through E bullet points that you see there. But after conversations with the directors, they wanted to have a little more flexibility to be able to identify those students who they believed would be appropriate for their educational programs. So that language was changed to demonstrating reasonable independent living skills and self-care in light of the student's age. And in this case, the deafness or hearing impairment, and for the Governor Moorhead School, that would be visual impairment. We did also keep the language about not having a medical or safety needs beyond the capacity of the school to reasonably accommodate, but we moved that down into the second item there. The other major change was there was a lot of concern about the possibility of people conflating these standards with the standards for consideration for special education under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So we added a footnote into this clarifying that this process is not to be confused with determining whether a student qualifies for special education services. So that's the purpose of adding that footnote there. Consistent with that, we also changed just a number of wording of different terms that were used in the statute or in the enacting legislation, but that tend to be terms of art within special education, terms like evaluate, determination, and we wanted to ensure that there was no confusion about that. And so we simply used some synonyms in order to try to clarify that this was not an IEP determination. So those are the major changes that have been made from the original draft, and this is on for a vote today in order to be enacted by the deadline of, I believe, this Friday.
Okay, any questions? I will tell you that Mr. Collins was very thorough when we met as a committee. He explained this to us in a lot of detail. So a lot of cleanup work has gone into what you saw last month and what you see this month. And this is, I feel like, a really good document. So are there any questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next thing are our discussion items. So EICS 4, State Summary of Academic Gains in Restart Schools and Research Study, Learning Loss and Recovery in Restart Schools. Dr. Garber.
Good morning, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, and State Board members. I am Julie Garber. I am the Reform Model Lead, and I'm happy to bring to you the State Summary for the Restart Annual Report. We begin today, as we always do, with a connection to your State Board goals. And so we have here, you see, a reference to Restart Schools within State Board Goal 2, Objective 7, and Component 1, and the reference being specifically about Restart Schools. We're looking for an increase for exceeding annual expected growth, that is growth overall and also by subgroup. So just making a connection there with your State Board goal. It is important before we begin to give you a little bit of a historical context of this report. This is the first time we've brought you a report since the pandemic. So just to give you some historical timeline on that, in the fall of 2019, we brought you data of 2017, 18 and 18-19, a comparison, and with a recommendation of some policy recommendations on actually how to monitor these schools. There was no monitoring process in place at that time. So we brought that to you, and our committee at that time said, please go out and do focus groups. And so in-person focus groups, and that is what we did. And so then in March of 2020, you approved policy updates and defining academic gain and what that is, and then also the continued authorization workflow, which continued authorization is required by statute. So that was March of 2020, the very first days, and of course we all know what happened on March 13th of 2020. So then we were impacted by the pandemic. In the fall of 2020, we brought to you 18-19 data. You see a gap in that because, of course, that was the first time by your policy we had a way to monitor, and so we were going backwards to monitor these schools. So 2020 was the first time we brought you this report with full data. And then fall of 21, there was no data because of the waiver that was given by the USED and the GA. 22, no data for you except for flexibility outcomes in this report, again by the waiver from USED and the General Assembly, and here we are today. So this is the first time we are bringing to you state data with the 21-22 data and giving you this report. So without any further ado, just context for you. Currently, we have 159 Restart schools, and you see them by cohort. We have them by cohort because of when they begin their implementation, and by policy, they have 5 years. And so we track them, and so they are tracked by cohort. For this report, it's important for you to understand that although there are 159 in total, this report is only about 148 of those. So and the next slide identifies that. And then you'll see also those 148, you'll have to pay attention that they are also reporting, but some of them have, for example, cohort 5 only has 1 year of implementation at that point. So please bear all of that in context of this reporting. When we begin, we want to share with you that academic gain results by policy, they monitor and determine if these schools are going to continue their authorization, and that's the authorization given to the district. We track them with some just simply above expectations, meeting, and below expectations. So that's how we track them for ourselves and for them to understand where they are in the process. They asked for progress monitoring, and that is what we provide to them. So we're going to share that with you. The next slide gives you the academic components. So there are 5 academic components. Again, this is by policy. The recurring low performing designation is first because that is the eligibility to become a Restart school. Growth status, achievement status, subgroup growth status, and then the flexibility outcome goals. The flexibility is a different color there on the chart because that is the first 4 are established by accountability. That last 5th one is a different color because that is defined by the school and the district. So it is their choice. They may have lots of different reasons why they want to use flexibility. They identify their goal, and then they monitor those goals. So it's a self-reported, and it's their own goal. So we'll start with above expectations. So above expectations means they are no longer recurring low performing, and they are meeting or exceeding growth. This is the goal. So we say it's on track, but ultimately this is the goal, and that they continue in that trajectory. And so you can see the number of schools in each cohort that are meeting that above expectations. We have 14% of Restart schools above expectations, and this is after the pandemic. So then when we move to meeting expectations, this is based on the workflow. This is part of policy. They have the opportunity for 7 different academic gain scenarios. It's a combination of any one of these things: growth status meets or exceeds, achievement increase, subgroup or growth, or flexibility outcome progress. So on the workflow, they have multiple opportunities to demonstrate their progress. And here we see that 64% of Restart schools are meeting expectations. That means they're on track. That means that based on that trajectory, by the 5 years, they will most likely be recommended to continue in their authorization. And then we have not meeting expectations. And this means that their growth status does not meet. Their achievement score, the net change of their achievement from the baseline of when they began to the last most current data, is actually 0 or low. So these schools, we would say, are going backwards. So they came in as recurring low performing, and they are going backwards according to tracking the data. 22% of these Restart schools are not meeting these expectations. By policy, we now have about 26 of them that are under required support. So they are required to partner with us. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So the next slide gives you a visual, and we're going to follow this same pattern for you throughout the report. We give you the data, we give you a visual, and then we're going to compare it to 18-19. So what you see here is tracking overall academic gain expectations. We've moved this chart to percentages because the number of schools in each cohort is different, and so we wanted to demonstrate percentages for you as a fair comparison. So when you review the exceeds expectations in blue, you have 24% of schools in cohort 1 exceeding, all the way compared to cohort 5. There are no schools in cohort 5 who are exceeding. And of course, they've only had 1 year of implementation so far. They are most recently recurring low performing. When we compare this, again, these overall expectations compared to 18-19, we see a decrease. So 2%, and we're going to move from the right to the left. So not meeting expectations, you see a 2 percentage point increase of those, not meeting academic gain. 3% meeting academic gain, and 6% decrease in schools. But again, this is after the pandemic, and just to point out, though, we have 14% of Restart schools who are exceeding academic gain expectations. So now what we're going to do is break down every component for you. So each component of the academic gain, and we start with recurring low performing. So in blue, you see that cohort 1 has the largest amount of schools who are no longer recurring low performing. And that in each cohort that decreases until, of course, you get to cohort 5. So there are no schools yet, and of course they were just came into the program. So now we're going to compare 18-19. So when we compare 18-19 data before the pandemic, we see a decrease in schools from the 21-22 and an increase in schools that are designated as recurring low performing. The second component that we look at in academic gain is the growth status. And I think you'll be interested to see this one. Growth status, of course, is meets or exceeds. That is how we're defining it. And we see that 74% of Restart schools are either meeting or exceeding growth, and 26% are not meeting growth. We thought that it would be interesting for you that we actually broke this down a little bit more. So on the next slide, we break down, because you have both, in that 74%, you have both meeting or exceeding. And so when you see that in this 74%, you have 26% who are exceeding growth and 48% who are meeting. So a little breakdown there for you, because I think it's giving those schools credit for being exceeding. So then we're going to look at by cohort for the 21-22 growth status, and we break down the cohort. We see in blue, we see a higher percentage of schools across all cohorts, except for 4, they've remained the same, who are meeting or exceeding in 21-22. When we compare 18-19 to 21-22, we actually see an 11 percentage point increase in Restart schools who are meeting or exceeding and this is again after the pandemic. So we'll move to component 3. This is the achievement score. I want to go through the definition or the goal of this component. The goal of this component is that the achievement score, the net change of the achievement score, will increase 5 percentage points over 5 years. So that's the end goal after 5 years. Of course, we're tracking them each year. This means that their baseline, what they came in, that achievement score is compared to the most current achievement score. So we track them for you by increased over 5 percentage points, increase between the 0 and the 499, and then declines 0 and below. So let me give you an example of increased, and this is from one of our cohort 1 schools. In 17-18, they had an achievement score of 39.6, and now their achievement score as of 21-22 is a 57.1. So that is a net change of a positive 7.5. So they land in that, in that increased 5 percentage points. So we have 16 schools who have increased their achievement score over 5 percentage points. And the range of that goes, yes, there it is, sorry, in my notes. So there's a wide range for that, and I'll point that out later. So 16 schools have increased achievement score 5 percentage points or above, 24% increased in between the 10th and the 499, and 108 have decreased below 0. So we'll put that on a chart for you to visualize that. So you can see that on the chart here. And of course, achievement change, net change by cohort. So we'll look at the comparison between 18-19 now for achievement score. And of course, we have a decrease for schools in 18-19 Restart schools who have increased their percentage points over 5%. In the middle, and then increase, larger 73% of schools have decreased below 0. So this is what we are seeing, very similar across the state with achievement and performance composite. But again, and this is where I wanted to point out the difference in range. We still have 11% of Restart schools who are above that 5 percentage points of achievement score increasing, and this is where I wanted to point out the range. That ranges from a 5.1 to a 7.7 percentage point increase. So we'll go to subgroup growth status now. And for this component, it is defined as 50% of the subgroups meeting or exceeding growth. And we have 84% of Restart schools that are meeting this criteria, 50% or greater of their subgroup meeting or exceeding growth. So that means 84% of those schools, and then 16% are below. We'll look at it in a chart format for you. And of course, we see this in blue. It's very clear that all of the cohorts have a larger percentage of subgroups that are at that 50% or greater subgroups meeting or exceeding growth. When we look at the comparison between 18-19, there is a slight decrease. So a 1 percentage point decrease, and then a 1 percentage point increase in those as compared to 18-19. The last component in the academic gain is flexibility outcomes, and this is what I mentioned to you before. These are defined by the school. And they track and they submit their incremental goal, they submit their data, and then it is evaluated whether or not it was demonstrated progress. So for example, if they said that their goal was to increase teacher retention and they demonstrated progress in that data, then it would be marked as measurable progress. The goal is 50% here because we believe that using flexibility means trying something new. And so that it may not always, it's not an expectation that 100% of their goals are met, because they may try something and it doesn't work, and then they reevaluate. But at least 50% of their goals should be demonstrating progress. Here we see that 74% of the schools are demonstrating progress, at least 50% to 100% measurable progress from using their flexibilities. We look at comparison by cohorts. So we have the same information for you by cohort. And then we have a comparison to 18-19 data. And then there is a slight decrease in the schools that are demonstrating measurable progress here compared to before the pandemic. With all of that student outcome data, I want to let you know that we have a tiered system of support to support these schools. So as you look at this slide, I'd like you to look from the bottom to the top. So we support all of our Restart schools. And these are a list of different things we offer. This support, I want you to know, is offered, it is not required. And then when you look at the top, if you can scroll down slightly to look at the top of that chart, the support that we provide to schools that are not on track for being able to receive their continued authorization are given much more personalized support. And that's a list of the things that are personalized. And again, by policy, with now the data, we are able to require support. And so what you see on the list is a list of things that we require support with the district. We work with the district, we identify a plan, and our comprehensive support specialist support these schools specifically, the schools in the district. So, we always give you this information next about flexibility. How exactly are these schools using their flexibility? And we've been able to track this for you. And so currently, based on the 2021-22 use of flexibility, again, I want to point out this is self-reported data, so that's make you aware. 95% of them are using budget flexibility, 36 employment requirement flexibility, and that, of course, is how they hire, and then calendar flexibility. So those top three are the flexibilities that are used the most. We want to break down for you each one of these flexibilities to let you know how they're used. So 142 of the 148 are reporting budget flexibility. And out of on the right-hand side, you see, and it looks to me from here, it's a very small print, so I hope you have it in front of you. But you can see that 75%, the highest reported use or strategy with budget is 75% additional staffing and flexible staffing. We look at employment requirement flexibility. Again, this is about hiring. 53 of the 148 are reporting using this flexibility. 64% hire non-certified staff. 100% of these 53 hire or place certified staff outside of licensure. We look at calendar. There's 43 schools that are using calendar flexibility. 65 are adding more teacher work days. 51% are using an early start or end to the school year. Those are the top two. Then we have standard course of study flexibility, and 7 out of 148 are using this. It is typically not, that's not even correct. It's not typical. We don't ever see a school changing the standard course of study or not using it. They are really using this more as a district flexibility in how the curriculum is used. So it's an opportunity for them to say, we believe that this curriculum may be better suited for our school, and work with the district that way. And then assessment flexibility. Again, there are very few assessments that can be opted out of, but one of them happens to be what used to be called the KEA, which is now called the ELI, and 50% of the Restart schools, 50% of the Restart schools of the 18, let me say it like that, 18 of the schools are using this flexibility, and then 50% of those 18 are eliminating the KEA. The next flexibility is one that we haven't broken down for you before. It hasn't been as much of a trend, but it is becoming a trend, and so we're bringing it to you. And 12 of the 148 schools are using class size flexibility. So because we've been tracking this since 17-18, we're able to bring you a comparison between 17-18, and so you see across the years how the flexibility has been used. And so I will tell you that they continue to learn and understand and how these flexibilities might be used, and so there's some ebb and flow in how they use them. And finally, I want to give you a rundown of our support. We have 4 full-time employees that are called Comprehensive Support Specialists. I just want to give them a shout out and thank them for always their hard work. They are committed to these schools and providing support for these schools and districts, and I'm ever grateful for their support. We strengthened our district support specifically this past few years, and then we also do a support survey, and on this that gets feedback from the districts. The support options with the highest level engagement according to our districts include Professional Learning Network, supporting them with the annual report feedback and the school improvement feedback, school improvement planning, and then help with flexibility. Another aspect of our support is about leadership. And so the two squares on the left I want to point out to you. You are familiar with North Carolina Instructional Leadership Academy, NCELA, and so any Restart school that was also identified as low performing, that principal had the opportunity with the superintendent's permission to attend ELA, and we're providing just connection and follow up with those principals. And then, of course, we always want to give a shout out to Office of Charter Schools and Ashley's team. They offered this past year 11. So every year they have increased this opportunity, 11 slots for our Restart Guest Fellows to attend. So both of those, I want to point out to you, are principal leadership support. And Restart is not a magic bullet. It is one tool in the toolbox for districts. And within that, we see that principal leadership is critical. So finally, I want to, I'll point this out as well. We, the past few years, it has been important to me to know from our districts and our schools, how are we doing? So we send a survey out to them, and one of the questions is, in general, how satisfied are you with the overall support you've received from our team? In 21-22, it was a 94% rating of between somewhat satisfied to extremely satisfied. You can see the number of respondents there. And then in 22-23, 97%. So I'm very thankful for that, because, of course, we also, besides the schools, we are always in the business of continuous improvement, and I want to make sure we are supporting. This last section for you is about continued authorization, and just a reminder for you that continued authorization is required by statute. It is in your policy, the DSTR 040, and this is the graphic timeline that demonstrates that process. If you look at the circle that says YR5, that is the year 5, that is the 5th year of implementation. We are currently in that 5th year. Not technically because of COVID. We've actually added 2 years, and you allowed us that buffer. But we are in the 5th year for cohort 1, and in spring of 24, we will bring to you the recommendations for these cohort 1 schools, whether or not they will be the district will be recommended to continue their authorization in the restart model for each of these schools. So with that, I recognize that that is a lot of information, and I will pause. We have one more section for you in this report, but I'll pause here before we go on.
So once again, fellow board members who are not as excited about statistics as I am, it's my favorite class in college. So I've dug into these numbers. It's pretty celebratory. So yeah, so that's my comment. So, and I would ask for any questions. Vice Chair.
This is probably more of a comment too. I agree, it's very celebratory as I was studying these numbers from this report. One thing that sort of jumped out at me is these are identified as lower performing schools through one of the identifier characteristics. And if you look at only 26% of those schools now do not meet expectations from a growth standpoint. We've recently seen some numbers for all of our traditional schools that don't have this charter-like flexibility. And they're around 29 or 30%, in our charter schools, which obviously have full charter school flexibility, are at 38% not meeting expectations. I think there's some messages here that tell us a lot about how much flexibility apparently matters in terms of the results that we can achieve, and I think we need to go to school on this as we think about the design for our children as we go forward. That's a significant difference.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Superintendent?
So yes, but my comment before the Vice Chair made his comment was going to be that I'm, as excited as I am about these numbers, I'm shocked to see the lack of flexibilities actually being used. So I don't know that we can correlate flexibilities to success. And I think that we are going to see, we have data coming to the board from our research and evaluation division that will compare low-performing schools who are not participating in Restart, their data to Restart data. That will show some similarities. It's going to vary based on tested subject, I'll just say that. But the flexibilities that they're using, the 95% figure that Ms. Garber shared, simply means, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, they're able to cash in those dollars for positions that they want. Is that accurate?
They are able to use that money, yes, and it is converted into the PRC 037 fund, and so they're able to use it with less restrictions.
Okay.
So I will say the 95% is interesting because, again, and that's why I said this is self-reported data. Technically, 100% of them have to convert into the PRC 037 fund. And so it's always important we are working to align support across state, district, and school. And so districts operate differently.
And then, follow-up. So then, I mean, a third, or just a little more than a third, are using the employment requirement flexibility. Less than a third are using calendar flexibility. As you mentioned, assessment is something that's difficult for them to use. It's difficult to use that flexibility for that, which accounts probably for that low number. I'm not sure what a standard course of study or curriculum flexibility would look like. Does that mean that they can opt out of certain standards?
So charter schools can do that as well, but no one does because they know how they're going to be tested.
Right.
So as I mentioned, it is what we see. We do see some schools actually adding a course that's not, we don't have standards for, or we see them asking for curriculum flexibility with the district. It's technically not flexibility, but the district is working with them to meet the needs of the school.
So perhaps it would be useful for all of us to have some more information about the specifics of that budget flexibility and how that's being used.
One moment. Ms. Jones?
I have a question. In looking at that 22% of schools not meeting expectations, I have a data question. Has there been analysis of, or is there an analysis of the correlation between schools within the same district that create that number? Like, do we have, say, the 9 schools in cohort 2? How many of those are in the same district? As a high school teacher, I'm thinking about feeder patterns. Are the elementary, middle school, and high school all not meeting growth? And do we have an analysis of how many schools within particular districts make up that number? To think about like the correlations between, as a high school teacher, I know I'm being measured by sophomore students, but those students were 7th, 8th graders going into the pandemic, so it's not the same group of kids. But if they're coming from the same feeder school, I may see patterns or gaps in their learning. So have we looked at the correlation between the feeder schools and the elementary in the middle or the middle of the high?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not.
Great questions. Wonderful question. Dr. Oxenden?
Thank you very much. This was a very informative report. A lot of data. It takes time to just sift through it in your mind. But it was a fabulous report. My question, I'm going to stay with the point about flexibility for a minute. And I would like to, I wonder if you have any way of knowing from the time of school, let's say a school that is now, began as in cohort 1 and now is in cohort 5.
So they don't change
stay in the
cohorts.
same-
If they are in cohort 1, that means they started in 17, 18, and they have 5 years to demonstrate some academic gain progress according to the workflow.
So let me rephrase my question. I guess my question is this. Over time, do you have any way of knowing if flexibility increased? Did the schools increase the advantage or take advantage of increased flexibility over time?
Yes, we can review their annual report. In their annual report, they have to report, and in their school improvement plan, they have to document what flexibilities they use. And so we could look at that to
I'd love to
determine
know
if
that.
they've added. I will say that when I began this journey, Amy White, the committee encouraged, help them understand how to use flexibility. And so we have sought to support them in that.
Just a little bit of follow-up, because and this is commentary, not a question, because I believe the essence of the rationale for the law and the following policies had to do with thinking hypothetically that flexibility would matter. So that's tied to my request for a little bit of information on the gradual increase, utilization of flexibility. My final question is, who would have been a respondent?
Oh, yes, so district and school leaders. So we support the district, and we have what is identified as a district restart contact. But it could have been it's sent to all the superintendents who have restart schools, the district leaders, and then all the restart principals. So all of those people were given the opportunity to weigh in on our support.
Thank you.
I do want to go back to the comparison that you're going to hear from OLR is about recurring low performing.
Yes.
So, thank you for those questions.
Continue on.
So we will move on as we,
Excuse me.
yes, sir.
Before you
Yes,
move
sir.
on, I want to go back to this word flexibility, because that's what jumped out at me
Yes.
more than anything else. But I was surprised to see conversion of dollars to positions versus the calendar. You hear so much about the calendar, but that's not being used as much for the restart schools. Am I correct with that? The calendar, flexibility in school calendar.
Is not being used as
As
much
much as
as
it-
budget flexibility?
Correct.
Correct.
As those
But,
schools.
but technically, they all have to use budget flexibility in the sense that they are required to transfer an amount of money based on the ADM into what's called the PRC 037 fund. They are all required to do that.
But I can see where the calendar itself could be more expensive, because you're talking about busing routes, you're talking about starting times, and things of that nature, which goes back to that funding source.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to get around
Yeah.
to.
It's certainly, the calendar flexibility definitely has a domino effect,
Right.
certainly.
But it appears that the longer they are in, which is an assumption, the better they become of those, with additional help, I'm assuming. Did you say that after that cohort one, they can come back again and ask for another 5 years?
Yes, sir. They, based on the policy, and we cleared this up in policy, that of course, they come in recurring low performing. The goal is no longer recurring low performing. If they get out of that designation, they don't have a fear of losing that. They have the opportunity to continue, and so they're given another 5 years to continue. And that came from board input.
Chair Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. To Mr. Hall's point, some of the concerns I've learned from superintendents about this model, not trying to disparage the success that schools have had with this model, is, for instance, on calendar flexibility. It's hard to run one school on one calendar with a transportation system that has to serve the whole district. Similarly, we've heard from superintendents that the transfer of money to support one school in the restart model has adversely impacted the district as a whole. I mention those points not to criticize the model, but just to point out the limitations that this model presents, and it merits further study and refinement. The biggest limitation, in my view, that this model brings is the schools that qualify for this model. We have so many more schools who can and need to improve their performance who don't qualify for this model. So it's as if we wait until they get to a satisfactory low level of performance before offering this type of model. But returning to the positive, Ms. Garber, for those schools that have performed the best in the study that you performed, what elements of the Restart model are most impactful for their success?
I am going to be excited to bring to you that information in the spring.
In the spring?
Well, I will be happy to answer your question and say that in the spring, we're going to be bringing to you those schools who are recommended to continue, and in the whole process, they will also have input to inform you. Here are the strategies that have been most impactful for us. So you will have the opportunity to hear from them. In terms of the currently the most impactful, I think in the budget and how they're using budget flexibility, you see adding personnel to the school. We know that is needed. So in terms of looking at their data, we know that 95%, and this was actually 18-19 data, 95% of schools who are in that exceeds category actually have subgroups, 100% of their subgroups who are meeting or exceeding growth. So there's a level of support for interventions that they're addressing their subgroup needs. So I can share two of those pieces with you.
Yeah, that's great. That's where my interest lies, is not just knowing whether they use, but how are they using them, and in the way they're using them, how is that having the greatest impact on our students in the circumstances that particular school faces. I know it's very nuanced and complex and difficult to correlate, as
It
the
is.
superintendent mentioned, but that's the kind of insight we need,
It is.
is how are school leaders that are taking advantage of these flexibilities, turning them into positive impact for students, and how are those schools that aren't able to raise performance using flexibilities? We can learn equally from those situations.
Yes.
But I would mention, we need it soon. The needs of our students are so
Absolutely.
significant, and every
Yes.
day is a day that a student doesn't get what they need. So,
Ms. Bledsoe.
I apologize. I was trying to find, is there a breakdown of the schools by the percentage that are elementary, K-8, middle school, or high school? When you mentioned flexibility, you mentioned KEA and the ELI. And so that made me spin. That's more of an elementary
Yes.
area there.
It is.
Are these heavier one way or another? And are those flexibilities like that used more predominantly in a pattern? I can say I know a school that uses ELI instead of KEA. And so I could see that, the flexibility of using one or the other. And so I just wondered if there were schools, if the patterns, elementary maybe were using one flexibility more than middle or high, and the percentage of positive outcomes from that.
So flexibility by grade span.
I know that's more work,
Mhm.
but it's just where my brain went.
Yeah.
Mostly to learn. I was thinking, if you're successful and you're an elementary principal and you were doing a restart school, maybe you could really look at which one was causing more gains and learn from others.
Yes.
Joe?
It's sort of a follow-up to Chair Davis's question, not about our having access to the information, but is there currently a support network amongst restart schools? So your tier 1 schools that are exceeding growth, are they in conversation with the schools that aren't? Because I know, to your point, how hard your interventionists are working, but sometimes you have to go there to know there, and the best person to work with administrators in low-performing schools are administrators who have had to fight that fight, or teachers who have had to implement those changes. So while we may not have that data, do they have access to each other
Absolutely.
during this
So
process?
very much from the beginning, I believed and understood that the knowledge is in the field. From how they're using flexibility, they needed to hear from each other. And so we have a professional learning network that happens almost monthly. And we are always raising up best practices in the field. So looking for those that are demonstrating progress and letting them share. Great
Thanks,
idea.
everyone. This is discussion, so we'll continue on next month. Continue what, you have some more?
Yes, sir. Actually, we have some data for you from Office of Learning Recovery, and I'm very thankful for their support, and we will actually look for opportunity to work with them and Dr. Jenny Korn's team as well for some of your questions. I think I'll need some support in that. We have for you Restart Learning Loss and Recovery. Kaylin Clifton is going to come up in just a moment. Just as a reminder, in a previous state board meeting, the Office of Learning Recovery provided a white paper analysis called they were bright spots on academic gain progress with specific focus on economically disadvantaged students in TSI and CSI. So the ESI committee requested that that particular report for TSI, CSI be replicated in some similarity with Restart Schools. And so we've worked with OLR and Kaylin to produce this, we've collaborated, but they've done the report. Let me just say it like that. So just the next slide, just a reminder, of course, that Restart is about recurring low performing schools. That's the eligibility. And so when you hear some of the comparison, you're going to be hearing comparison between Restart schools and non-Restart schools, those that are recurring low performing. And again, this goes very well because these are the same 148 schools that were discussed in the report. So I'll ask Kaylin to come up and then finish with some conclusions.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Kaylin Clifton, Research Analyst, Office of Learning, Recovery, and Acceleration. I am going to just briefly walk through some kind of summary information on learning loss and recovery among Restart schools. Like Julie mentioned, there is a comparison group provided. Recurring low-performing schools, Restart schools have been separated out from those. And I'll be glad to stick around and answer any questions that you may have. For what it's worth, I'd also like to add that if there is a desire for additional analysis, more than willing to look into that. I heard a lot of questions about maybe associations between certain flexibilities and student outcomes. Be glad to step in there. So the table here that you see in front of you just kind of summarizes some basic information about Restart schools by cohort. So down the left-hand column, the first column there, you see our 5 Restart cohorts. Other schools, well, first, the very bottom row, that's recurring low performing, not Restart. And then other schools, that's the sum of all other schools around the state. The columns then from left to right give you the first year of Restart implementation ranging from 2017 to 2022. The next column, that's the total number of schools in that cohort. So cohort 1, 55 schools. About 2/3 of Restart schools joined in the first 2 cohorts, which also means, as you can see in the next 2 columns, that the majority of students that are in Restart schools come from the first 2 cohorts, Restart schools making up about 5% of state students. The final column, all the way to the right, that is a measure of the average student enrollment at the school. On average, Restart schools are a little bit smaller than other schools around the state. However, there's a lot of variation in the size of Restart schools. For example, the first row, skip down to the 4th row, cohort 4, the average school there, that's 418 students, but cohort 5, 617 students. So just a little descriptive information about the schools. The next slide tells us a little bit about the students that are served by these schools for the same groups, each Restart cohort, recurring low performing but not Restart, and then other schools around the state. The blue bar, the navy bar, that's cohort 1, followed by the purple bar, cohort 2, teal, cohort 3, orange is cohort 4, green is cohort 5, and then the gray, recurring low performing, not Restart, and then the light blue, at least on my screen, those are other schools. You can make many comparisons here. I've included some small bar labels to give you the values of the labels. I made them small so that they're there for you, but they're not overly obtrusive on the scale of the graph. So for example, cohort 1, 2% of students within that cohort are identified as AIG, as compared to 4% of recurring low performing but not restart, or 10% of students in other schools overall. Just to summarize the remainder of the information here, economically disadvantaged students, or EDS. Students in Restart are much more likely to be identified as economically disadvantaged. Multilingual, ML, same conclusion there, much more likely to be identified as multilingual students. The next group there is students of color. Restart students are much more likely to be of color than students in other schools, slightly more likely than students in low performing or recurring low performing but not Restart. And then, as you can see in the very bottom group, students with disabilities, fairly evenly distributed across school groups here. Here are just the summary results that I'm going to kind of give you some visual information on with the graphs that follow. I'll read them directly off the screen. I'll kind of focus on them as I go in the graphs, maybe pepper in a little detail here and there. And again, you can feel free to ask questions that may arise. Number one, students in Restart schools experienced slightly less learning loss during the 2020-2021 school year than students in recurring low-performing schools by 0.05. Okay, so if we recall the way that we measure learning loss, basically what we're trying to do is capture the difference between where we expect students to be in the absence of the pandemic and where they actually ended the school year as measured by state standardized testing, whether in 2021, 2022. These numbers are essentially decimals to about 2 decimal places, and although they look small, they can be quite meaningful. I'll add in some context there as well. So that 0.05 there, that tells us that students in Restart schools experienced slightly less learning loss in 2021 than students in recurring low-performing schools. Number two, Restart students were also closer to their pre-pandemic expected scores in 2022 than students in recurring low-performing schools by about 0.07. So again, the same thing that happened in 2021, we see in 2022, Restart students being closer to where we would expect them to be in the absence of the pandemic. Bullet 3, we're now getting into some definitions of recovery here, which I'll pepper in some information there when we get there. Comparing performance within the same subject between 2022 and 2021, Restart schools experienced slightly more recovery than those in recurring low-performing schools, with greater recovery in science by 0.06 and math 0.04 than in ELA at 0.02. The second definition of recovery, comparing students to their own performance in the previous year, Restart students experienced slightly more recovery than those in recurring low-performing schools, with greater recovery in math at 0.05 than in ELA. And then, as pointed out earlier, these outcomes will vary by subject and cohort, whether cohort 1, 2, 3, and so on. For additional context on these measures, these 0.05, 0.07, we at OLR generally encourage people to just use, to always use the actual raw number, but to use small, medium, and large to describe these. Small being between 0 and 0.05, medium being between 0.05 and 0.20, and large being anything past 0.20, and I'll point that out in the graphs. All right, so the next couple slides, that's going to be bullets 1, 2, and 3, and I'll hit the high points again, and please take note of any questions. So here, these are our effect size measures for 2020-2021. This is how we captured learning loss during the 2021 school year. Down the left-hand vertical y-axis, you can see the subjects just organized: math, ELA, and then science. Across the bottom, that is the scale that measures the magnitude of those measures, in this case, again, as we define learning loss. Key here to interpreting this graph is the line of 0. If students nailed their pre-pandemic expected score, that is to say they scored what we expected them to, all of those bars would be at 0. But what we see here, the bars extend to the left, and that tells us that on average, regardless of whether a student was in Restart or recurring low performing but not Restart, those students experienced learning loss during the 2020-21 school year. However, relevant for our discussion today are the differences between the blue and purple bar, especially compared with in subject, blue being recurring low performing but not Restart, purple being Restart. If you were to make these comparisons across the graph, on average, this is where we saw the first bullet. Restart students did not experience as much learning loss, and that also holds true within subject. So for example, if you look at math grade 5, the top bar, The blue bar, which is recurring low performing but not restart, extends further to the left, indicating more learning loss than the purple bar, which is a little bit to the right of the blue bar for restart students. And again, here is where we see less learning loss, and by subject, the restart advantage, if you will, is approximately equal across math, science, and ELA as it pertains to learning loss in 2020 and 2021. Now we come to 2022, and this is going to lead us into a discussion of recovery. One cue here that recovery happened is the fact that all of these bars extend, well, they do not extend as far to the left. Therefore, they are closer to zero, meaning that between 2021 and 2022, students, regardless of recurring low performing status, restart status, subject, were recovering. They were approaching where we would have expected them to be in the absence of the pandemic. And much like in 2021, in 2022, the purple bars are closer to zero than the blue bars, telling us that students are closer to their pre-pandemic expected scores in restart schools than recurring low performing counterparts. In this case, the differences are greater in math and science than in ELA. So now we're going to have just a little bit of brief information on two definitions of recovery, this being the first definition, which I'll term subject level recovery. Essentially what you see visualized on the graph before you are the differences between the first bar graph and the second bar graph. So the very top blue bar, if you were to look at the math grade 6 blue bar in 2022, compare it to the math blue bar in 2021, that would be the difference. The fact that these bars are to the right of zero mean that students in that subject were gaining progress back towards their pre-pandemic expected score. You can see that for the most part, except with some differences in middle grades ELA, all of these bars are to the right, meaning that across subjects, regardless of school group, students at the subject level were making recovery, especially more so in restart schools. I should add, what does it mean? What is subject level recovery? I should have started with that. This essentially asks the question, how are, for example, students in math grade 6 doing this year as compared to students in math grade 6 last year? So we're watching the same subject between 2 years. We're not following the same student over 2 years. We're observing one subject over time. Next slide. There's also been some interest in how these differences may vary by cohort. So here I have collapsed all of the tested subjects into kind of their master subjects. So rather than show all the tested subjects within ELA, you're now looking at the average measure across all tests in ELA, whether grade 3, 4, 5, etc. And down the left-hand y-axis, you can see the information broken out by cohort, whether 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with the measures for recurring low performing but not restart being at the bottom. You can take the difference between any of the top 5 groups and that bottom group to try to arrive at the difference between a given cohort and what we are deeming here as their comparison group. One thing to point out here again is that these outcomes vary by cohort. As you can see, some of the bars are farther to the right, some of the bars are farther to the left, but also by subject. So for example, you can see that the purple bars in math overall extend farther to the right, telling us that there was more recovery in math regardless of cohort. This kind of leads into the final point for me today. So I mentioned earlier 2 definitions of recovery. We saw some information on subject level recovery, that is watching one grade as scores change between 2 years. Also in the data, because for a certain subgroup of students that participated in testing in both years, we can also watch how their scores change as they progress throughout school to the next grade. So that is what we see here. I'll give some detail on exactly how to interpret this graph. So on the far left-hand side, those are just kind of some traditional transitions that students may make as they progress through school. So for example, the first in the upper left-hand corner, ELA grade 3, ELA grade 4. The bars that are then to the right represent the average difference in that student's progress back towards their pre-pandemic expected score for students who made that transition. And then you can see 2 bars there broken out for our 2 groups of interest. recurring low performing but not restart, and then the next one is restart. The legend tells us that they're color coded according to those three categories: small, medium, and large. So just as an example to interpret the very top bar, you would say that students who transitioned between grade 3 and grade 4, according to ELA, between the years 2021 and 2022, and they were in restart schools, their scores improved by about 0.06. They were approaching their pre-pandemic score by about 0.06, whereas their counterparts in recurring low-performing schools that are not restart schools, they made that same type of progress, but only by 0.01. There's a difference of 0.05. So that would suggest that something perhaps is going on that is unique to restart schools that supports student progress as students progress from grade to grade over time. And then just the same interpretation all the way down. Here, kind of like just a couple slides ago, I've now collapsed it to the cohort level, and we're also again looking at the overall subject rather than the individual tested subject. And again, this here is tracking students over time to see if they are improving upon their previous year's score. You've got ELA at the top, math at the bottom, cohorts 1 through 5, and then recurring low performing but not restart. You can make all different types of comparisons here. A couple that jump out to me is just overall in math, there's more progress as students move higher up in their grades, telling us that in math, students are much more rapidly approaching their pre-pandemic expected scores than in ELA. You can also, again, take the differences between the cohort bars and the recurring low performing but not restart bars to arrive at, well, how much more progress are students making in those schools than perhaps they would be if the school had not entered the restart program. At this point, I am going to, I believe this is my last slide. I'm going to welcome Julie back up. She'll offer a few comments on this slide, and I'll hang around to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Kaylin. So just as we finish, how do we use this recovery analysis? So just noting that the middle school grades ELA, grades 5 through 7, and ELA overall may be an area of deficit to continue to look at. And so just to share with you that we've already reached out to Amy Ryan and then Dr. Christy Day, understanding that Office of Academic Standards is doing a lot to support middle schools ELA, and so we will be working with them to see what kind of that we can support restart schools in these areas and making the districts and schools aware. So. I do want to publicly thank Kaylin for his work. Just very much appreciative of his hard work digging into the data for us and for you.
Ms. Campbell?
Ms. Garber, I would maybe add or request that you think about another bullet point here, sort of piggybacking on what Chair Davis talked about a little while ago. These 297 recurring low performing schools that are not restart schools, perhaps we could reach out to those folks and see if we can identify what is keeping them from being interested in this program.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do know that last fall when the data came out and is accurate, we sent communication to anyone who was eligible.
They do have some feedback that might help us tweak some things that would make it solve some of the problems that Chair Davis was referring to. That might be helpful.
Thank you, Ms. Chemnitz. Vice Chair?
2 questions. When you had SOC students of color, who was in that? Are there some demographics within that group, or what is that intended to indicate?
In this case, I have defined students of color as a member of any identified racial group within the data who is not white. So it would include Asian, Pacific Islander, Black, Hispanic, multiracial. I believe that's some of that.
So is there any demographic breakdown of results for those students in those, in some instances, widely disparate cultural backgrounds?
Yes, that would be something I could do for our purposes here today. In order to just have concise slides, I collapse them down to one group.
last question, just for the lay person, as a generality, and it's trying to tie it to this. Have the findings been from your office that the losses were more significant in math than in ELA during the course of the pandemic? And since the pandemic, since schools have returned, I don't know if we can call it fully normal, but back to normality or direction of normality, that the recovery has been swifter in math than it has been in ELA. Is that a fair generality for all of us to think about?
Yes, that is true in the data that we have. I think one question that I often think about that's related to that piece, even though it's true that there was less loss in ELA, we're also seeing less recovery in ELA, and might therefore the losses be, shall we say, more stubborn.
Right. So thank you.
Thank you.
Could I just add that caveat, except in third grade EOGs?
Okay. Dr. Oxendine?
Thank you, and I'll make this brief because I know you're wanting to move ahead. But if you'll go back to a previous frame, it could be one before or a couple before. I want to focus my question on this. It had to do with third grade, non-restart, recurring low performed third grade going into grade 4, compared to the restart, recurring restart. Here's what my question is this. I think it would be important to know some other differences. Like, for instance, knowing something, isolate those schools, maybe a few schools, I don't know how many, maybe 15, with similar demographics, okay? And find out a little bit more about, peel back the onion skin a little bit further, and find out about leadership, find out about the retention of teachers, or the mobility of teachers over time. So getting into some of the qualitative pieces, it might be case study that I'm talking about that would take additional time. But there's so many factors, and everybody in this room knows it. There's so many other factors that kick into determining whether schools achieve or they don't. So if we could find just a little, not just a little bit, I'm asking, that's quite a bit, but it's those factors that really determine, they're pivotal.
So a couple, I guess, responses to that. So first, if there are data that exist on these factors that we're interested in, which I believe there are, that would be something I can work with, merge it into these measures I have here. We can then do things like look at correlations between flexibilities, which were mentioned earlier, and these certain types of outcomes, and we can do that with relative ease. Also, although not presented here, today in these graphs, we're just looking at the average differences between these two groups. They're not adjusted for things like demographics, but along the way, as a fellow lover of statistics, of course, I dig in the data. I'm curious. I like to see things. And it is true that when you make some more rigorous comparisons, for example, comparing restart students to students in recurring low performing schools in the same school district and adjusting for demographics, on average, these differences hold. And I don't want to get too far into that because that's not what I'm presenting. But that would suggest that something uniquely associated with restart schools makes a difference. But without the types of additional data that you are speaking of, we wouldn't be able to necessarily hone in on those. But again, if those data do exist, then we could hone in on those. And again, I'm willing to help with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Chair Davis.
So this is exactly the kind of information that we hoped for when we supported the superintendent's establishment of OLR. This is exactly what we need. But to Ms. Camnett's point, we're only reaching 1/3 of the number of schools we need to reach. So, and we're only talking about 5% of our schools. So for all its progress, we're not reaching enough kids. Moreover, in the group of restart schools, there are some that are performing well and some not performing so well. So I would find it incredibly helpful if this analysis was taken to that next level. What is it that the most successful restart schools are doing? And how does that compare to everybody else?
And then, I mean, I think we also need to look at what the CARES Act is doing, because there are a lot of other schools that are getting intensive support. Not enough schools are getting the support that they need, but there are myriad ways that low-performing schools are getting support in addition to this is one of 4 models that we have to deliver intensive support. And so I think we're talking about a broader study here, which we are happy to perform.
I couldn't agree more. We need a better understanding of all the strategies we're using, as well as the challenges that our students and teachers are facing, to find the best strategies. Because what we need clearly is a rapid expansion of whichever models are most effective in whichever set of circumstances they match up with.
And I have to say that if everyone at the board table is in agreement that our current accountability system is not adequate to define school quality. However, if we are simply looking at ELA and math scores to quantify the number of low-performing schools, we can also all agree that we have significant work to do in those 2 areas. But I can't not say that what our elementary school teachers have been doing for the past 2 years with the professional development they've gotten around letters will have been the most significant thing we can do to support chronically low-performing schools. That's 50% of our challenge. If we're just talking about performance in reading and performance in math, which are critical to students' future success, then we can say with certainty that we have tackled a huge, we have bitten off a big part of the elephant. And so now what we need to do, as we've seen with, and this board will see next month when we start looking at EOG scores and EOC scores, now we need to look at adolescent literacy and how we are going to support those students who are not illiterate but are not able to do the kind of reading that one needs to do to be successful in high school and beyond.
Thank you. Great comments. Thank you both for your presentation. Yes, sir.
And I think this has been said, basically, but I agree with Chairman Davis. We need to be reaching more students, but sometimes we assume because the school is meeting standards that they they don't need the attention to do better. And I don't think I've found some really great schools, but I've not found a perfect one that's beyond improvement. And we need to take all the information we can gather from the flexibilities and everything else and make sure it's shared with every school we can possibly share it with. And even the best schools should be looking to improve.
Thank you very much for the comments. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Caleb. I will now turn to Ms. Schaefer for our next 2 items, EICS 5 and EICS 6.
Good morning. I think it's still morning, members of the board and Madam Superintendent and members of the public. Actually, EICS 5 and 6 kind of go together, and let me give you a little bit of a framework. So what EICS 5 and 6 are policies with regard to district and regional support, and particularly with regard to the assistance teams that have been appointed in many districts, another strategy. So this is part of our decennial review, which we're required to resubmit all of our policies through the Rules Review Commission, or all our rules, through the Rules Review Commission, as an update to make sure they're all updated and to get rid of the ones that are not needed anymore. And this process is going to take us through 2026. That's our timeline. And we are glad that the district and regional support team or folks are the first to come forward. They get a gold star for that. because it's going to be a lot of rules coming before you for revision or updating in the next few years. So the first EICS is policies, and EICS 5 is policies. EICS 6 is redrafted rules. So what the rule is that you need to put in policy what the agency does. And what is external to the agency is what needs to be in rule and go through the rulemaking process. So you will see that in some of these, one of these policies, the assistance team policy, we actually took from the current rule and put it in and proposing to put it in policy instead of in rule because it's an internal working. So let me just go through these really quickly and present. This is for discussion, this particular meeting, and it will be back before you to consider for action at your next meeting. So the first one is about the policy regarding an appointment of an interim superintendent in districts that are supported by the assistance teams, and the second policy is about the assistance teams functioning themselves. There is authority in the statutes to do this, so it's in the authority is in the statutes, but the policies give more meat around the bones about what the process is going to look like internally. So be aware that these authorities have been in the statutes, and we have some rules already to do these things, but we're trying to make sure we have rules that guide the board and the staff. So the first one is the interim superintendent appointment that the state board may do. Permitted into the statute if an assistance team recommends that, or if it's a low-performing school that is continually low-performing. It's only been used once. It's not something we hope to use again, and hope we won't have to. But the staff felt strongly that there needed to be some clarity on what the board will look at. So we had a team get together, about 10 folks, that included HR and finance, and the folks from the district and regional team, including the deputy superintendent over that area, and then Dr. Petrie Martin and myself. So it was a discussion. We tracked the process that has been used in the interim superintendent appointment process that the board used a few years ago. And what is before you for consideration is proposing the factors that the board will consider that were considered in the time this was used, including the length of time the district or schools have been low performing, the turnover rate of superintendents, the documented financial concerns, the extent to which the local board or district are willing to work with the assistance team, non-compliance with federal or state requirements, and the relationship between the local board and the local superintendent. So the idea is to look at whether that the appointment of an interim superintendent is needed or appropriate to improve student performance in the district if there are barriers to that. And again, that's the time and the only time which an interim superintendent will be considered. And then the interim superintendent would be under contract of employment as a DPI employee, and would this allows the SBE to retain any state funds that DPI has allocated to the district to pay the superintendent and use those to pay the interim. So those were unanswered questions during the process that came before. And then there's a requirement that an interim superintendent will report back to the state board on certain matters. So that's the proposed policy on that one. The second proposed policy is about the assistance teams and the role of the assistance teams, and that's before you as well in that policy, and you have copies of these draft policies in your materials. It basically takes what is in the current rule and puts it in policy as far as the role of the assistance team and the function of the assistance team, and that includes that they're required to keep information confidential. They're required to evaluate employees, and there is processes for the assistance teams recommending dismissal of employees within the school that has an assistance team, either teachers or assistant principals, directors, supervisors, they're allowed to recommend the removal of those folks. That is very, very rarely done. We do have a lot of assistance teams out for individual schools and 6 district-wide assistance teams. But again, we have to have something in place that makes sure that their rights are honored. This says what the assistance team will do. You will see back in the rule, we keep processes for if there is a dismissal recommendation, how that will look. And again, very rarely used. I don't want anyone to think that this is something that is done often or lightly, but we need to have rules in place because we have the legal authority to implement these and required to have the rules. So that's EICS 5, those two policies. EICS 6 is a set of 4 rules that are recommended for updating. In the information presented to the board, there's a strikeout of the things that we're recommending be removed, and an addition of things that underlined that are recommended for adding to the rules. So the first one is a dispute resolution process. That would be rule number 0.0304. Before there was a mediation process, the statutes have changed to require a decision maker when there's a disagreement in how the school improvement plan is approved. If there's a disagreement between the school and the assistance team, then there's a process for, and between the board to some extent, there's a process for resolving that. We now have to have a decision maker instead of a mediator who has the final authority to make the decision. So you will see a lot of information is crossed out that is from the old statute, and a lot of the new information is put in there that makes it a decision-making process instead of a mediation. That's the upshot of that one. The second proposed rule is the assistance team, which we just talked about. You will see in the proposed rules that all we have left in that rule, which is 0.0307, is the local board of education and local school employees shall cooperate with the assistance teams in the performance of their duties and comply with all requests to produce information and give the assistance team access to staff and students. The rest of that current rule is going to be moved into policy, which is the one we discussed in EICS 5. So then we have 2 more. One is the due process protections for school employees who are recommended by the assistance team for dismissal. We have a lot of statutes that go over what due process protections for teachers who are being removed from their positions when they're under contract or still have career status have to be afforded. This repeats a lot of what is in the current dismissal statutes. But we have been told by the Rules Review Commission we're not allowed to cite to that statute and rely on it because this is not covered specifically in that statute, so we have to repeat them. So this basically says what happens, what the process is for a dismissal when it's recommended by the assistance team, and also there's also under items G and I think G, H, and I are about license revocation proceedings too. Those have to be in rules. And the last one is suspension of the powers and duties of school boards. Again, this is on the books already. It's nothing new. We've not used it before as a state board, but it just sets out the things the state board will consider and the notice that will be given to the district to the extent that the suspensions of duties that are authorized by the statute take place. Let me make one more comment about the rulemaking process. That we are not permitted to leave statutes and just leave the statutory language in the rule. So sometimes they can feel disjointed because you're not allowed to just repeat the statute. When looking at a rule, you really need to look at the statute and the rule together, because what the rules do is just augment what the statutes tell us to do or allow us to do. And that's our state board's addition to the rules so that it can be implemented and with notice to the field what those new implementation rules are. That make sense? Okay. That's all I have. Any questions?
Questions, Ms. Schaefer?
Thank
Dr.
you very
Oxenden?
much. Thank you so much for the presentation, or the explanation and presentation. The question that popped in my mind as I listened to this has to do with, is there anywhere in writing, whether it be policy or rules or maybe just DPI protocol, that defines the composition of an assistance team and their duties?
There is a description in the statutes of the assistance teams, and I've got Dr. Martin here and Dr. Garber. So they probably are more familiar with that than I am. I'm just the lawyer, but.
Right.
um,
I don't mean to put you on the spot. You were making such a fine presentation, and that popped in my head. But the reason I ask is if I were superintendent or a member of a school board or principal of a school, I might want to see that in writing. I'm sure that there are practices, but I just wonder if that's anywhere around.
I have not studied that issue, and I can certainly get you an answer, but I think there's some guidelines in the statute about what the assistance team needs to look like, and then there's some description of what their jobs are in our proposed rule. I'm not sure we have.
So that if there's any questions or pushback, we would have something in writing. Thank you.
Thank you for your
Anything else that
question.
you all have to add?
Mr. Hall? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay,
Go back
if
to
we
the
could,
last slide, please.
let me let Dr. Martin come up and add to that, because I know they have guidelines they follow.
I can't point to where it is, but we can definitely bring it up and look at it. But I can tell you for members of what Allison has shared with us, our CARES team is equivalent to an assistance team. For example, our school leadership coaches or principal coaches, it has been tradition through all of the models at the department. They have been people who have served as principals and who have evidence of turning around a school. And so we followed those same guidelines when constructing the CARES model. For our district leadership coaches, those are former superintendents or those who have worked at the central office level. And so those are the things that we have kept similar through the models, but we can definitely dig into the statute and pull that out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Mr. Hall?
And the times that would be appropriate to put in policy is if the board wants it in policy or it thinks it needs to be there to direct the staff about assistance teams, but they have the flexibility now to appoint who they think is needed for a particular situation, so you may want to let them
Chair
have their
Davis,
guidelines.
If I could, Chair Davis, I would recommend that we go further with that. I don't know whether we would call it a study, but to consider having something very concrete and clear in writing about composition of teams, our assistance teams. Sounds like there are more than one type of team out there, and the duties and responsibilities.
Mr. Blackburn, could your committee take that under advisement?
We'd be glad to.
Thank you.
Chair. Mr. Hall? Thank you, Chair. Quickly, Council, go back to the last slide. I just want to make sure I understand. The last one.
Is it the chart? Or?
Yeah, the
Okay.
last one. The last bullet that dealt with local boards, the power of local boards to be suspended. There it is, right.
Thank you.
Right. Is this new?
No, it's
Chairman?
not. So if you
This is in the statutes now?
there's two places it's been in the statutes.
Okay.
One is in the assistance team statute, which we have added the sites to that new statute. But there are several times when local powers and duties of the state board, of the local board, can be suspended by the state board. And one is failure to cooperate with an interim superintendent appointed by the state board. And the other is when the assistance team recommends that that be done because they're not getting the cooperation they need from the local board.
That's important. That's very important.
It's been in the statutes. We're up, and it's been in our rules. It's just we're just updating it.
I don't think that's well known. Thank you, Chair Davis.
Mr. Hall, I appreciate you bringing that up. And just to clarify for anyone listening, our preferred model of supporting districts and schools is collaboration.
Absolutely.
This is a last resort.
And we have not used it.
Right.
We have not found it necessary to use it. So
We will use it if the performance of our students does not rise sufficiently. I mean, that's our job.
That's right.
But our preferred method, as we've demonstrated with a number of districts in the state, is collaboration. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Any other comments? Thank you.
Thank you.
Schaefer. That concludes our report.
Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. We'll now move to our final discussion of the morning, Educator Standards and Practice Committee, led by Dr. Olivia Oxendine. Dr. Oxendine.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair Davis, joining me in this responsibility of chairing The ES&P is Dr. Donna Tipton-Rogers. We have a very short agenda this month. I know you're probably getting ready to smile on that. Dr. Tomberlin is coming forward to present to us a series of changes in a couple, maybe at least two licensure areas. These are perhaps three. These are significant changes, clarifying to the field what needs to happen in terms of an educator who has gone from a CPL and reverted back on the basis of performance, has reverted back to an IPL. The things that have to happen in order to get back to CPL, that's where we desire. And then also some clarification around the lifetime license. So Dr. Tomberlin is ready to present.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oxendine. Good afternoon, board members. So LICN 005 does focus on licensure renewal requirements, and this is one of our policies that required some updating in terminology and for clarity purposes. Also, we're going to address the issue of what's called license validation and the rules related, the policies related to that, and just some cleanup on our CEUs, and then clarifying the North Carolina retired employees and how they are licensed. So the first section here is just technical changes, replacing local LEA with PSU to align with other State Board of Education policies, inclusive of charter and laboratory schools with PSU terminology. So I know